Welcome to Conjuncture. My name is Jordan Camp. I'm really delighted to be here with Dr. Arun Kundnani. Arun is an associate of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam and a public intellectual. He's the author of a number of works, including The Muslims Are Coming and The End of Tolerance. And he's currently completing a new book, Resistance is Not Enough: Radical Antiracism in the Neoliberal Age. Taken together, Arun's work contributes to scholarly and public debates about racial capitalism, Islamophobia, surveillance, and the war on terror in both the US and the UK. I'm really delighted to be speaking with him in his home in Ithaca, New York today about his work on racial capitalism and counterinsurgency. So thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me today, Arun. I really appreciate it. Well, I want to start by talking about your work on the history and theory of racial capitalism. You've published a series of essays, including What is Racial Capitalism, Abolish National Security, and the Racial Constitution of Neoliberalism. And in them, you're drawing out consistent links between racial capitalism, counterinsurgency, and surveillance. And you make the point that the concept emerged in the milieu of radical London in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And so I kind of want to begin there because you've argued that this geographical context is really important. So how did you come to the concept, and what is racial capitalism?
In England in the late 70s and early 80s, in a particular milieu around black struggles, around anti-racism, around journals like Race and Class, you get that exact kind of phenomenon around that time. And it's about, so what's going on there is you've still got in Britain at that time the working class movements, the labour movements at their full strength, more or less. They've still got their political clout. You've got the struggles of African and Asian and Caribbean peoples, which is intertwined to some extent with those kind of struggles, but has its own particular different history and impetus as well. You've got the kind of anti-imperialism of kind of washing over Britain with exiles from Southern Africa, with people involved in struggles in Latin America, in the Caribbean, all kind of coming to Britain and being part of this scene. And you've got the flow of ideas and people and stories from the Black freedom movement in the US, right? And so kind of in this mix, something really interesting happens, right? And it's a mix that's actually more about people who aren't from Britain coming to Britain and all meeting each other in this, place that obviously is a hub precisely because of its imperialist history, right? So, it's in that space that you get people like Sivanand, people like Stuart Hall, I think at the peak of their kind of political and intellectual creativity, developing ideas and arguments that for me remain indispensable for thinking about racial capitalism, although neither of them use that term. But for me, when I started becoming involved in that similar kind of work in the 90s, I was schooled by people who'd come from that milieu, and I was fortunate enough to kind of learn at their feet, as it were. And you just take it for granted that this is the world that you're in when you're coming through. But later you realise that actually something quite special was going on there, that you were able to taste a little of a little bit further down the road. Now, as I say, neither Stuart Hall or Sivanand are using the term racial capitalism. But for me, the term racial capitalism is about a way of trying to think about the relationship between race and class fundamentally. And of course, that relationship between race and class is one of the central concerns for Sivanand and Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall is nowadays, very well known, I think, in academic circles. Sivanand not so much. Back at that time, through the 80s, really into the 90s, and in Britain, the two names would have been placed side by side and seen as the kind of two towering figures in terms of thinking about black struggles, anti-racist struggles in the UK. Sivanandan didn't really kind of get picked up and travel as much, mainly because he's not working within a kind of academic setting. But his work is certainly, you know, of equal importance for me, and I think should be for anyone who's interested in these questions. Now, it's in that milieu that you start to get the term racial capitalism. I think first appears in print in a pamphlet published by the exiles from South Africa who are involved in the anti-apartheid movement. You know, where London was one of the hubs for that. Who start to use the term racial capitalism specifically to understand what's going on in South Africa, which, you know, as you know, at the time, was there's kind of two key things about that. One is the South African struggle against apartheid was one in which the Communist Party of South Africa was, you know, a major force, and therefore Marxism was a major intellectual reference. At the same time, Marxism was, in its kind of orthodox form, very hard to fit to apply to the particular context of apartheid, which, you know, to put it very simply, seemed to be not about a confrontation between kind of waged industrial workers on the one hand and owners of capital on the other, which is what you would get if you take the model from Volume 1 of Capital, but something that was about a system of white supremacy imposed on, you know, African populations, right? And the racial antagonism would seem to be central there. So you get this, I think you get this creativity around the challenge of thinking that through. What needs to go from the Marxist orthodoxy in order to develop Marxism in a way that it can make sense of this particular context? You know, it's like Fanon's well-known phrase that Marxism needs to be stretched if it's going to be applicable to questions of racism and colonialism. And, you know, stretching doesn't mean just throwing it out. It means you have to rework it, you have to remold it. And that's what I think all these figures are doing at this time, right? In very interesting ways. For example, Stuart Hall picks this up and says, this is also what's going on in plantation slavery, right? You've got a workforce that is unwaged on the plantations, but nevertheless is also integrated into the global capitalist economy, right? Because the you know, the cotton that's being produced on the fields of Mississippi is then being shipped to Manchester to, you know, to be turned into cloth by waged workers in the north of England, then again shipped to somewhere like India to be sold in a colonial context of monopoly capitalism, right? So there's a kind of way in which that formula that's developed as a way of explaining the existence of a structural racism in South Africa can be applied in lots of other contexts as well. And that's, I think, why this set of ideas that come out of this milieu becomes incredibly useful, you know, for us today in the United States to think through these questions around race and class that we're struggling with politically today.
That's really helpful. So, you know, Stuart Hall writes this classic essay, Race, Articulation, Society Structured in Dominance. He's responding to Harold Volpe's work on race and class in the apartheid state. And of course, Volpe had escaped apartheid South Africa, made it to London. They were in touch with each other. And then Sivanandan is the director of the Institute of Race Relations, the editor of the journal Race and Class, where you had also been an editor. You know, major figures as intervening in this decisive conjuncture. Another figure, of course, was Cedric Robinson, right? Who, as you well know, was there finishing his book, Like Marxism. You've taken up this concept to theorize and to analyze the racisms of the border, of counterterrorism, and of the war on terror, and argued persuasively that these need to be understood as part of a broader neoliberal project. And I really wanted to ask you about that, about, you know, how might centering racism, indeed racial capitalism, enrich our view of neoliberalism on one hand, and how does it challenge popular or taken for granted definitions of the concept on the other.
Yeah, so there's so much been written about neoliberalism, right? 1,000 articles a year or whatever. So I think what you see by and large with all of that scholarly work on neoliberalism is a systematic downplaying of questions of racism and neocolonialism, right? So we can take David Harvey's kind of as an example, not because he's the only person that does this, but is representative. The story, we get a standard story of neoliberalism that we can get from David Harvey, where the neoliberal intellectuals gather together in Montpellier in Switzerland just after World War II. They kind of come out with this philosophy of free markets. They're in the wilderness for a couple of decades. They get their opportunity in Chile in the early 70s with Pinochet to try out these new ideas, and then they kind of go on to be the dominant ideas with Thatcher and Reagan in the 80s, and we create the new neoliberal world, right? Now, when you look at how that story is told, it's told in terms of essentially a class story. With someone like David Harvey, it's told in terms of, there was a crisis in the late 60s, early 70s that was about the rising power of the working class in Europe and the United States, and neoliberalism was the way that capital kind of responded to that by kind of seizing the opportunity in this moment of crisis to change the rules of the game and push back against Keynesianism, welfare state. We know all this story, right? So again, we can, with Fanon, we need to stretch it. Right, we need to stretch it, and that kind of story is only half the story. The other half of the story is the crisis was as much a crisis of race and colonialism as it was a crisis of class. And of course, even putting it like that doesn't quite capture the ways that those were all intertwined with each other, right? In ways that hopefully I can convey. So, if you think, for me, if you look at and start with the intellectual level of the kind of neoliberal thought, right? And you can read a lot of commentaries on people like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. Never really get much reflection on how they thought about race and colonialism as well, right? So someone like Hayek, who seems, if you read most accounts of kind of neoliberal intellectual history, there's certain figures like von Mises, who might be thought of as someone who has racial views at certain points, Rupke as well. Hayek is presented as the kind of one who's freed himself from those older prejudices to kind of give you a neoliberalism that's more modern, in the sense of it's ditched its legacies of kind of racial prejudice, right, from earlier periods, right? Actually, that's not true. What Hayek is doing is reworking racism, and what he's doing is he's thinking about racism no longer in terms of a kind of 19th century idea of biology, but in terms of, he's got an idea of cultural evolution, right? And so race is there, it's just in a new language and a new vocabulary, a new set of terms. And I think that's important, because when you look at how neoliberalism then plays out, as we go through the neoliberal transformation, for me, that's in the 1970s. It enables us to understand how part of that is a reworking of structural racism, right? That have been challenged by, on the one hand, the Black Freedom Movement in the United States, in the UK, but equally importantly, by decolonization, right? Which redraws the map of the world, and so much of what neoliberals are thinking about through that period is what to do about decolonization. How can the idea they have of the kind of world they want to create now be created in this new context of decolonization, right? And what their reasoning is that the challenge is actually about culture. It's first and foremost a matter of culture. That for them, to take a step back, neoliberalism for me is a set of ideas and practices that are about trying to disaggregate mass movements that emerged, from the late 19th century through the 20th century that aim at redistributing wealth. And how can we disaggregate those movements to stop that from happening, right? What you're getting then is the need to think about the question of surplus populations, both within the United States, but also in other parts of the world, because what neoliberalism is also doing is it's a form of what Marx calls primitive accumulation. In other words, you are through privatization of, in particular, land, people who are still embedded in rural economies where they're dependent on land outside of kind of wage labor, they're being uprooted and exiled because the land's being privatized from the kind of communal arrangements that existed before. It's a kind of new enclosure. And so then they're being thrown up as exiles from those rural settings. They're turning up in the cities, but the cities are not able to absorb them into wage work as they were in the development of capitalism in, say, England in the 19th century. So again, the Marx model doesn't work. Marx's account of primitive accumulation that is based on what happened in England in the 19th century is not transposable to thinking about what's happening in a third world setting in the 1970s with primitive accumulation there, because there isn't the absorption of these people into a new industrial workforce. And it's just not possible. What you get is a permanent surplus population of people who aren't even able to be exploited according to the way that Marx describes as wage workers, right? You get surplus globally, you get surplus within the United States. And the question then is how, these populations then represent a kind of challenge, a threat, an anxiety to neoliberalism, because they are outside of the systems of market discipline that neoliberalism wants to use to kind of maintain its order, right? Someone who's not in waged work in the United States is not disciplined by market competition over the price of their labor, right? This is where things like broken windows policing start to come in, because these are ways to say, well, we need to create some system of pricing in this person's life. It's the pricing of punishment, right? Of going to prison, rather than being able to discipline them through market in a literal sense, right? And this is where we get things like the war on drugs, the war on terror, and so on, as ways of managing these surplus populations around the world, right? And actually spaces within which these anxieties about the limits of market logic, and what in their terms are interpreted as the cultural limits of a market logic, are worked through in those spaces around counterterrorism, around counter-narcotics, around bordering.
Thanks for this, Arun. Your work on racial capitalism and neoliberalism, as you were just saying, are part of your broader research project on counter-radicalization, on policing, and on counterinsurgency in both the US and the UK. In 2015, you published the book, The Muslims Are Coming, situating the war on terror, its mass surveillance programs, and a much longer history of counterinsurgency. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that argument and how an analysis of the history of counterinsurgency enriches our understanding of policing in prisons.
Yeah, well, I spent a year or so traveling around the United States, actually, to different parts of the United States to interview like people working on counterterrorism in police departments and FBI agents and folks like that. People working in like fusion surveillance centers, right? So I was interested in just kind of how are they framing this work that they're doing on counterterrorism. Like how does the various policies that are out there kind of start to play out through the particular local settings that they're in. All those kind of scholarly questions you might ask about that stuff. And then, what started to come out through all that research, when you're actually talking to these people, is how, for them, they're part of this global thing. They're part of this global counterinsurgency project. There's no other way to put it. I mean, you would, I remember going to the FBI field office in Houston, Texas, right? And you walk in to their, they've got one of these. They love their gadgets and their computers and their big screens and everything, right? And so you go into one of these rooms. I can't remember what they call it. Their control room, where the skiff, where you have to leave. They call it a skiff. You have to leave your cell phone and your electronic devices outside and all that sort of stuff, and you look up at the top of the room, and there's the clocks for all the different time zones in the United States. But then after that, there's a clock for the time zone in Iraq and a clock for the time zone in Afghanistan. So you're like, well, like the very way that you're thinking about your time in this room where you're doing this counterterrorism work is connected to these wars going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. You see yourself as part of this same thing. And, it turns out when you talk to these FBI agents who are working on counterterrorism, at least 1 in 3 of them have come from a military background. And when you ask them about that in the interviews, they say, well, what they think they're doing in Houston, Texas is essentially a continuation of what they were doing earlier in Somalia or Yemen or Pakistan or Iraq, right? And you say, well, what exactly is that? And they're like, well, building relationships with local leaders, trying to identify in the Muslim community amongst the leaders and the people of influence, who's the moderates and who's extremists, who's the ones who are against us, who are the ones for us. Right? It's like, wait, you're saying, so, like on paper, what the FBI agent is supposed to be doing is like following leads where there's some kind of indication that some kind of crime is taking place. But no, what he's talking about is that's counterinsurgency, right? Textbook. So you understand, and this is, the same is exactly the same is true in Britain, in a way that's much more overt at the policy level, where the policy will talk about a need to counter Islamic radicalism using the same methods in somewhere like Birmingham or Bradford in England with large Pakistani populations as it would do in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Aimé Césaire talks about the boomerang, right, of the practices that were imposed for European colonialism in other parts of the world, then coming back to Europe in the form of fascism, right? That's how he understands the origins of fascism, is as this kind of boomerang back from colonialism. And in a way, the same is true for the kinds of police violence that we see in the United States. Indeed, the rise of Trump, in a way, is a boomerang back from the war on terror. Trump was, in a way, just making explicit what was already implicit in the policies of the war on terror, with his Muslim ban and so on, right? So I think it's crucial that we have that kind of global part to our analysis.
Yeah. I want to ask you too how an analysis of counterinsurgency enriches our understanding of racial capitalism itself.
Right. Well, so if we think of racial capitalism as the kind of starting point for thinking about racial capitalism, if we think about what we were talking about earlier in terms of South Africa, in terms of Stuart Hall, and this would be true for Cedric Robinson as well, is the idea that capitalism doesn't homogenize, it differentiates, right? In other words, there isn't this kind of inherent tendency in capitalism to create a single kind of industrial working class, where everyone's abstract labor is interchangeable. It's structured through race, amongst other things, right? And so, and when you get into neoliberalism, where you have these large surplus populations who are never brought into the waged parts of capitalism, right? The question then becomes a matter of policing those populations, finding some way to impose a kind of market discipline on them that isn't done through their employment in waged work, right? So that's where you then get the question of, firstly, racism comes in, because racism becomes the way that neoliberalism manages that boundary between these different categories, right? It becomes the way that you manage the boundary between your kind of waged workforce that has certain entitlements and privileges within the kind of core capitalist societies. Then there's a boundary between them and, for example, undocumented migrant workers who are kind of subject to the authoritarianism of the border, as a way to control that labor. You have the boundary between the core and the global surplus populations who are kept out through borders, right? Borders, again, central, right? So, and that kind of militarized bordering to keep the surplus populations out from being able to enter into the core of capitalism is, again, a racialized process, right? So race comes in that way, but all of that is also about counterinsurgency, because what is the kind of anxiety about these surplus populations is that they aren't subject to market discipline. That's kind of the key thing for neoliberalism, right? They aren't subject to market discipline. So the only thing that can discipline them is force, right? And the only thing that, and the again, because as I was saying earlier, it becomes a question. So the political conflict between the neoliberal system and those sectors that are opposing it, right? That's a political question, right? Like the mass mobilizations of the third world in the late 60s and early 70s, trying to create a different world in the aftermath of colonialism, right? All the mass mobilizations through the 80s and 90s against structural adjustment programs, against the new kind of global institutions like the WTO that have been created in the 1990s to institutionalize a kind of neoliberal rule, right? All of those movements, which Seattle is famous in the 90s as this kind of place where the WTO is challenged, but really, that is just one part of this much broader struggle going on around the world in all kinds of ways, against the IMF, against the World Bank, and so on. All of those movements are political opposition to a political system that's being imposed, but they're interpreted by neoliberals in terms of culture, right? So political antagonism is reframed as a cultural matter, and the argument is, well, it's not that they're politically opposing us, it's that their culture means that they can't adapt to this modern, globalized, neoliberal world that we're trying to create. So that is one, and their understanding of culture is as a fixed kind of thing that determines your behavior, your way of life, and everything. It's kind of like a quasi-racial way of thinking about culture. And so that's one way that racialization comes in. All those debates about the borders and so on tend to coalesce around fixed ideas of culture. But it also means, therefore, some kind of counterinsurgent violence is necessary, right, to contain these movements, because they're ultimately founded in a kind of cultural problem, right? They're ultimately about a cultural inadequacy, which means a racial inadequacy, right?
Yeah. Thanks for this, Arun. It makes me think about your argument that Islamophobia serves as a form of what Antonio Gramsci called common sense, or a kind of taken for granted way of, interpreting and understanding the world. And you take this concept up and extend it to help us understand how it is that Islamophobia has naturalized counterinsurgency. It's displaced an analysis of the political economy of neoliberalism onto the terrain of culture, right? And so, I wanted to ask if you could explain that argument and, how does having this analysis of Islamophobia, as you put it, as a structural feature of capitalism, challenge the kind of common sense notion of the term?
Yeah. So normally when we think about something like Islamophobia in the United States, at least, it's an idea of individual prejudices and intolerance. Something that requires education, kind of awareness training, that kind of thing, right? We want to do something about including Muslims into mainstream institutions and that kind of language, right? It's inclusion tolerance. And think about the kind of images that are central to Islamophobia, right? So certain ideas that the key idea of Islamophobia in the United States is that there's something inherent to Islam as a religion that makes you prone to violence, extremism, fanaticism, something like that. Now, you look through the archives, look through the history. You don't see that in the way that Islam is talked about very much at all before the 1970s, right? Where does it start? It starts really around, again, the oil embargo. What happens with the oil embargo is you get this a moment of crisis in which all kinds of people are having to cut back in their own personal consumption because of the price of oil going up. The price of oil is not subject to market forces according to the economic textbooks. It's actually determined in other ways. But it was presented as an example of, well, they're cutting back on supply, so the price needs to go up. You understand supply and demand. You're going to just have to cut your budgets and adjust your life to this new scenario that we're in, right? That was the messaging, right? So it was a way of introducing that kind of neoliberal argument about market forces, prices, and so on. Even though in an earlier period, the price of oil could have been set by government policy, irrespective of international circumstances. They chose not to do that. So what happens then is that frustration about this essentially reduction in your living standard in the United States is then redirected towards the idea of the wealthy Arab sheikh who somewhere in the Middle East is able to manipulate the price of oil and manipulate the world economy. Starting to look a little like some of the kind of anti-Semitic tropes about the Jewish conspiracy and so on, right? That and in the pages of the journals like Foreign Affairs, the kind of house journal of the US empire, you start for the first time to see these kind of discussions of, well, what is Sharia? What is jihad? Anxiety about the potential of Arabs or Muslims through the fact that the fact that oil is a lot of the world's oil supplies are in Muslim majority countries, that this presents a danger to the system, that if there were a kind of Arab political radicalism that got control of the region, it could hold the whole capitalist economy to ransom. It would be, you read Foreign Affairs at the time, they're talking about the potential of Arab radicals to get control of Saudi Arabia and form a Marxist third world alliance with China to kind of overthrow capitalism. It's like that. Now, so Islam becomes folded into this idea of a limit to neoliberal markets, a threat, the danger that, and it gets connected to the Palestinian cause, right? Because it's the Palestinian cause that takes the question of Arab radicalism beyond the level of governments, right? Governments can be dealt with. Governments, they will save themselves. The Arab governments will follow the general principles of international relations. They are amenable to pressure through aid with conditions, in the end through military action. You can deal with governments. What you can't do is deal with so easily is a popular insurgency, which starts in Palestine from the late 60s, after the Palestinians can no longer rely on neighboring Arab governments to advance their cause, and that becomes evident with the 67 war. That's the birth of the PLO as a popular insurgency for Palestine, right? So the fear of Islam gets tied to the fear of a kind of Arab radicalism, which is attached to the idea of the Palestinian insurgency, and there's kind of series of displacements there we get, right? That's where it comes from originally, right? Now, what happens we get kind of new iterations of that then developing, especially after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which you remember calls itself the Islamic Revolution, and as in the 1980s you start to get the beginnings of more and more criticisms of Israel in the United States, the efforts by the Israelis to say to the US public, look, when you look at what's happening in Israel and Palestine, this is not a question of a military occupation and human rights and so on, as it was starting to be presented, but it's a question of culture. It's a question of a Western country like Israel confronting a third world insurgent, radicalized culture like the Arabs, right? And so the problem isn't our politics, it's their culture. becomes the formula for that Israel wants the US public to adopt in thinking about the conflict in the Middle East, which is starting to become actually important in the United States, because the United States is, in Lebanon and it's funding Israel and so on at this time, right? So, and then in the 90s that becomes generalized, right? So it becomes a matter of saying that there is a problem, not just of a kind of Palestinian culture or even an Arab culture, but of Islam, right? It becomes a global thing, and you get from the neoconservatives, you get quite an open effort on their part to say, well, Islam is going to be the new enemy now that communism is gone. We haven't got an enemy. We need an enemy to kind of stitch up the social fractures in our own society. Islam is going to be the new enemy, and then after a war on terror starts, that becomes that idea of the clash of civilizations between Islam and the West becomes central. So too does a kind of liberal version of this, which has a different kind of register, but also works through ideas of culture.
In a current moment marked by a global economic crisis, resurgent nationalisms, the COVID-19 pandemic, the worst refugee crisis since World War II, I've been struck by your argument that the war on terror is unable to shore up the consent that it once did to permanent war. And of course, we can see this through the withdrawal of forces in Afghanistan, calling up memories of the defeat of the United States in Vietnam in the middle of the 1970s. Yet, of course, if you have pointed out, the war on terror persists in 85 countries. And so, can you talk about how it is that the war on terror is able to persist in this political environment, and also your argument to be wary of liberal strategies of counterterrorism, particularly around countering violent extremism, including the threat of white nationalist insurgency?
I mean, I think what's happened is really that the kind of rhetoric of the war on terror has gradually kind of petered out in its ability to kind of engage and mobilize, kind of popular engagement around this, right? And so, and in a way, Trump was a death knell for that part of it, because the whole thing got folded into the whole question of Trump and people's attitudes towards him, and then there was it kind of, I mean, the war on terror was no longer rhetorically effective as this kind of bipartisan space anymore, right? It became a thing that got sucked into Trump. Now, at the same time, because all of that rhetoric that had been mobilized over the years was bound up with all kinds of institutional practices that are still in place. All that infrastructure globally is still in place. So we are still conducting war on terror operations in 85 different countries. We are still, conducting military occupations in various places. We are still engaged in all the surveillance and all the policing globally that we were before. So that all continues, and it no longer needs the kind of daily assertion of a kind of war on terror rhetoric politically in order for it to continue, right? So, and what's striking to me, I think, about all of this is I've been writing about the war on terror since it began, right? And kind of throughout that time saying, look, there's this thing going on that's going to be destructive to so many people's lives. It's flawed in all these ways. Here's where it comes from. Here's the analysis. Blah blah blah. And you kind of think that at some point there'll be an end point where you can kind of look back and say, well, here's the balance sheet of what was done. Here, we can sum up and we can hold accountable. To some extent, wars end. In the past, wars ended, and there was some kind of process like that. After World War II, in particular. And yet, in this case, even though we and this, this simple fact cannot be repeated too often. We went to war in various countries with no moral or legal justification, almost certainly resulting in well over 1 million people's lives lost, tens of millions of people becoming refugees. This is a genocidal level of war, and the people who carried it out and who were its cheerleaders, just get to carry on doing their thing and move on. They move on to the next gig, and we just haven't begun to think about what some kind of accountability would look like. And of course, we haven't done the accountability for Vietnam. We haven't done the accountability for so many things. But right now, the next gig for these people within the national security system is, for some of them it's China, but for a lot of them it's the far right, as we were just saying, right? And so what they've figured out is, and this is a thing that happened under Trump, they figured out that they can, a lot of the stuff that was about kind of counter-radicalization, countering violent extremism that was kind of bubbling up through the war on terror can now be presented as something that is equally applicable to the far right in the United States, right? So, and they might define it as white nationalism, domestic terrorism, whatever terminology they have. And so then the question is like, do we want to see, some kind of neo-Nazis or white supremacists targeted in the same way that we saw Muslim communities targeted? And kind of like, that's how the question's presented to us, which is not actually how we should think about this, right? So firstly, there's no way that the thing can just be transposed from one group to another in that way, okay? So, the whole way that the thing was structured with thinking about counter-radicalization of Muslim communities in the United States was, the logic was, the logic is this: there's two kinds of Muslims, the moderate Muslim and the extremist Muslim. Our job is to distinguish between the two through mass surveillance of all Muslims, right? We need to know as much as we can about the lives of every Muslim so that we know whether they're a moderate or an extremist. And the extremist ones are the ones then that we need to target, whether that's through criminalization or some kind of other intervention, right? And the moderate Muslims need to be won over in that kind of counterinsurgency style to be our allies in this struggle against the extremists, right? And of course, what counts as being a moderate or extremist is incredibly flexible, and you are considered an extremist, for example, if you are someone who's critical of the foreign policy of the United States, critical of the war on terror. So dissent gets read as extremism if you're Muslim, right? Now, what would it look like to transpose that to the far right, right? In what is the broader community around far right extremism? Is it white people? Are we going to do a thing where like we're winning over white moderates to tackle the white extremists? Are we going to surveil the white people on suspicion of white supremacism? Like, how are we even defining what this looks like? It's just not going to happen, right? It's not transposable like that. So what you're really looking at is, and this is the proposal coming from, all the national security agencies like the FBI and so on. What they're really proposing is that we give them the authority to define what white supremacism is, and to define its remedies, which will mean criminalizing of a small number of people, right? While the rest of structural deep-seated racism in the United States can get ignored, right? Because we can satisfy ourselves that, well, the FBI are dealing with it now, right? The FBI and all the mobilizations and all the thinking and energy and efforts that communities have developed for centuries to think about this stuff can now be swept aside, as we're all supposed to use the language of the FBI, language like violent extremism or domestic terrorism. This is not the language really to describe what we're dealing with in the United States, right? What's more is that there's just no way that these national security agencies are grappling with the full extent of the far right in the United States and what it really represents. Before we even talk about, kind of structural racism, just thinking about the far right, talking about, tens of thousands of people involved in armed groups who are willing to use violence and intimidation to promote, a reactionary agenda, right? And it's not something you can kind of grapple with simply through thinking about it in terms of a criminal justice model of how you're going to deal with these people, right? You need to go way deeper into thinking about where this comes from, right? And what produces it. And again, and the answers are going to be very, in a way, there's a parallel with understanding the war on terror. Like the war, so the mistake that the war on terror made, or one among many, but the kind of analytical error in the war on terror was to think that what it called terrorism was this thing that was sui generis, that it didn't have any kind of political conditionalities to it, and it wasn't involved in any kind of, and states themselves weren't part of the process by which this conflict was constituted, right? So, the war on terror is not a war on terror. The war on terror is a military and cultural and political conflict between Western governments and various non-state actors like Al-Qaeda, right? Both sides in that conflict are necessary for there to be a conflict. They both co-constitute that conflict together, right? And each side is deciding when to use violence and what kinds of violence to use based on how it's interpreting the other side in that conflict and its actions. There's a kind of mutual imbrication going on between the two of them. What the war on terror does is it says, well, we're going to ignore our own part in this and just think about what they're doing as if it comes from nowhere. And the famous phrase 9/11 came out of that clear blue sky. No, it didn't. It came out of a history that the US government itself was also involved in, right? To say that isn't to to kind of justify violence on either side, but it's just to acknowledge a kind of actual causal process that was there in terms of how that violence arose, right? Now, when you think about the far right, the same is true. That far right doesn't come out of the blue either, right? It comes out of a history that the state itself is also central to, right? The far right is, in a way, is simply it's a kind of parasite on the state's violence, right? It's simply saying, in a way, what the far right does in the 21st century is simply say, we've been told by our own government that there are all these threats out there. There's the threat of people crossing our borders. There's the threat of Muslim terrorists. There's the threat of of narcotic gangs. There's the threat of black radicalism, and we simply agree with our own government. Those are threats. We just don't think the government's doing enough to fight them. We're going to do some fighting of our own. Right? That is the key. That's the kind of bottom line of what the far right are about. And so they've been radicalized by their own government, right? And so then we want the government to de-radicalize and counter-radicalize them. That's the problem here, right?
One of the things that's clear here is that, the bulk of the far right actually come out of the military, out of the police. 1/5 of the people arrested on January 6, 2021 in that siege on the Capitol.
Exactly.
That was the case, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
It's important that we have this structural context for interpreting the relationship between racism and counterterrorism. And, one of the things that you do in your forthcoming book, Resistance is Not Enough, is to argue that liberal anti-racism has long served to naturalize war, torture, mass imprisonment, and you argue instead for a conception of racism that is structural and trace a conception of structural racism out of radical anti-racist, some of them we've mentioned, like Amy Césaire, but also prominently C.L.R. James. So I wanted to ask if you could reflect on how James's writings can aid us in confronting structural racism in our own time.
Yeah. So, and we could. What I do in the book, I try to do is to kind of trace a trajectory that C.L.R. James is there, Césaire, Fanon, Nkrumah, Claudia Jones, Jamil Al-Amin, right? And I try and trace a trajectory of what I'm calling radical anti-racism that is a different trajectory from liberal anti-racism, right? And you trace that, you could do that in a number of different ways. There's all kinds of other figures that you might want to bring in to trace that history. Obviously, it's somewhat arbitrary, the choices I've made. What's particularly interesting about CLR James is, in relation to this, is so the word racism, right, in the English language, first appears in a kind of systematic way in 1938, when there's a translation into English published of a book in German with the title Rassismus by Magnus Hirschfeld, right? So Hirschfeld was a sexologist. He's kind of runs an institute in Germany, in the Weimar Germany, researching sex. He's a gay rights activist. He's Jewish. As the Nazis rise to power, they kind of shut down his institute, they burn his books, and he's exiled, right? And so he writes this book Rassismus in the 1930s while he's exiled in France as a way to understand Nazism, right? And so the word racism, comes from there in English, right? It comes from that moment. It's an attempt to understand Nazism. How does he understand Nazism? What he says is that there is a set of thinkers, in the kind of late in the late 18th century and through the 19th century, thinkers in Europe who develop an ideology that he calls racism, which then kind of filters down into everyday consciousness in countries like Germany. So we're talking about individual attitudes and beliefs, which then the Nazis are able to manipulate and exploit in order to make their bid for power. Okay. So it's very much about individual attitudes and beliefs. And that's translated in 1938. Now, in the same year in 1938, CLR James is using the word racism as well, right? In his journalism. He's writing about racism as a thing that he's seeing in colonialism in Africa, right? And the way he's writing about racism is it's about how land, labor, rights are structured according to kind of informal rules that determine how that society allocates those things. And so it's a structural idea of racism, right? So what happens is that that kind of liberal version of what racism is becomes central to by the end of World War II, it's become a kind of part of the US's own kind of official public messaging about why it's fighting World War II, right? That kind of anti-Nazi argument about racism as this set of ideas. So then that liberal idea of anti-racism gets picked up by people like Franz Boas, Ruth Benedict, Gunnar Madao, becomes the kind of dominant way of thinking about what racism is and how to fight it in the United States, through subsequent decades, right up to in the last few years with Trump. That becomes the framework again for how we understand what Trump was, right? The idea that he's this kind of charismatic leader who's manipulated these kind of racial attitudes that were out there, and the way to tackle it is through trying to counter these ideas, right? What you have then alongside that in this other tradition, this kind of radical tradition, is a way of trying to think about what it might mean to talk about structural racism, right? Part of the reason that one of the impetuses for writing the book is everyone was talking about structural racism in 2020. Like all the big corporations putting out statements saying we oppose structural racism. No one could say what it was, right? Like, and people who did say what it was, their way of talking about what structural racism was simply to say it's like when there's a lot of racism amongst individual attitudes, right? It's like actually basically still that liberal idea of anti-racism, right? Like we need to kind of just do a lot more persuading other people to be less racist in their ideas, right? What the radical tradition says is something different, which is Fanon, for example, makes this argument, which seems to me crucial today, which is a society can be racist without without the majority of people in that society being racists, right? Like, it's a structure. It doesn't require every individual person in that society to believe in it. In fact, in that kind of setting, which is how Fanon talked about colonial Algeria, right? And the racism of colonial Algeria. What he's saying is even then, in that kind of setting, the majority of people amongst the white settlers in Algeria aren't racists in the sense that they're signed up to some belief system. There's a minority who are. They're the honest ones, because they at least acknowledge the basis on which that society operates, right? The liberals who don't are out of step with the very structures of their society that gives them the privileges they enjoy, right? And that's the situation in the United States today, right? So this other tradition, I think, offers us a way of making sense of what we're up against today. It's the question then becomes, well, what is that structure, right? And that's where I think then the ideas about racial capitalism come in and can help us understand that. In other words, the structure in structural racism is precisely this relationship between the capitalist mode of production and other modes of production in the same social formation, or those parts of the social formation that are kind of surplus to the core capitalist part, right? It's that boundary that generates structural racism, right? In the way that Stuart Hall, I think, still gives us the best description of. So the book tries to develop that argument and apply it to how we might understand what we're up against today in all those infrastructures of bordering, of policing, of incarceration, of war on terror, counter narcotics, and so on.
Well, thank you very much for sharing this preview of the book, Resistance is Not Enough, Radical Anti-Racism in the Neoliberal Age. And thank you for joining me for Conjuncture, and it's been really a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thanks very much, Jordan. I really appreciate it.
And I want to thank our viewers and our listeners for joining us for this episode of Conjuncture. Please stay tuned.